I still remember the sting in her voice, the way she leaned over my desk, her glossy lips curling into that condescending smirk as she dropped the printouts I had asked for. "You're just here to take notes," she said, each word soaked in disdain. I didn't answer. I didn't even flinch. I just smiled politely and thanked her. But inside, something shifted. It wasn't the first time someone had underestimated me. Not even the 10th. People always saw the quiet ones as weak, as easy to step over. Especially when you're the one blending into the back of the room, scribbling notes, double-checking everyone else's work while they take credit for yours. That day, though, it was different. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't angry. I was ready. But to understand why that moment meant so much, I need to take you back. Back to a cramped kitchen with flickering lights where my mom used to tell me, "People like us don't get promoted. We work hard so others can shine. Be grateful they even hired you." She wasn't being cruel, just honest, in her own worn-out way. My mother cleaned houses for a living. She taught me to be humble, to say yes, to be early, to speak when spoken to. She taught me survival. But survival doesn't build legacies, and I was tired of just surviving. In college, I worked 3 jobs and still went to class with my eyes burning from sleepless nights. I typed essays on my phone during subway rides. I interned without pay, fetching coffees, getting mistaken for someone's assistant when I was actually the one writing the reports. Then I got the job. Junior analyst. A title that felt like a crack in the ceiling I'd been staring at my whole life. I thought things would change. But titles don't protect you from people who think you're disposable. Especially people like her. Madison. She was fresh out of business school, connected, confident, and beautifully cruel. The kind of woman who wore designer suits and never touched the same coffee cup twice. She was assigned to assist me. On paper. But in practice, she made sure I knew my place. She interrupted me in meetings, rolled her eyes when I spoke, forwarded my emails with corrections, minor things like commas or tone. She called me sweetheart once. I corrected her. She never said it again, but the smile she gave me that day told me she didn't need to. Everyone saw it. No one said a word. Because that's how it works in corporate life. Silence is currency. And I didn't have enough to spend. But I kept going. Every morning, I showed up before her, stayed later, took on the work she skipped, ran the numbers twice, met deadlines, beat targets. I listened more than I spoke. But when I did, I made it count. There were moments when I questioned myself. Nights I stared at my ceiling and wondered if I was invisible. If I was really just here to take notes and stay quiet. Then came the project. The one that would change everything. A high-stakes proposal for a billion-dollar client. Our team had 6 weeks to prepare a pitch. The pressure was suffocating, and suddenly, Madison was too busy to help. She dumped her share on me, claiming she had networking events and strategy meetings. But I didn't push back. Not because I was afraid, but because I saw it. The opportunity. So I worked. Nights, weekends, holidays. I studied every inch of the client's history, needs, pain points. I rewrote the deck from scratch, infused it with fresh strategy and long-term vision. I even practiced the presentation alone in my living room, speaking into the mirror with a voice I was finally learning to trust. The day of the pitch, Madison tried to take over. She stood in front of the projector, flipping through slides she didn't understand, mispronouncing key terms. The client looked bored. I stood up. "I'll take it from here," I said calmly. There was a pause, a flicker of something on her face. Shock, maybe fear. Then I walked forward and delivered the pitch I had built from the ground up. When I finished, the room was silent. Then the client smiled. "This is what we've been waiting for," he said. 2 weeks later, we landed the deal, and I was promoted. Senior strategist, a new office, a new title, a seat at the table. Madison didn't speak to me for days, until the promotion ceremony. That's when she walked up, still trying to keep the upper hand. She held the cup of coffee I had once fetched for others. "Here," she said, holding it out with a tight smile. I took it slowly. "Thanks," I said. "You're just here to take notes, right?" And I turned away. I didn't look back when I walked away with the coffee in my hand. The taste was bitter, cheap beans, too much sugar. But that wasn't the part that lingered on my tongue. What lingered was the silence behind me, the weight of her pride folding in on itself. It wasn't revenge, not really. It was justice. A quiet one. The kind that doesn't require applause to be complete. But let me tell you something. You don't get to that moment without being broken first. Because before I stood at that podium, before the title, before the pitch, I had been humiliated more times than I can count. And not just by Madison, by people I loved, trusted. When I graduated college, I invited my whole family to the ceremony. I thought maybe, just maybe, they'd see me differently with a cap and gown. Thought the degree would make them proud. Only my grandmother came. My mom said she had to work. My sister didn't even respond to the invite. And my dad, well, he never really stayed long enough to be invited to anything. But my grandmother, my abuela, she showed up in her Sunday best, holding a plastic bouquet she bought at the corner store. She kissed my cheeks, whispered in Spanish that I was going to rewrite our name. That night, when everyone else was celebrating with family dinners and champagne, I went home to a studio apartment and ate ramen. I sat on the floor in my gown, the tassel still pinned to my cap, and cried. Not because I was sad, but because I was tired. Because I knew this wasn't the end. It was only the start of a longer, lonelier fight. You see, success doesn't feel like the movies. It feels like early mornings when your alarm goes off and your body begs you to rest. It feels like missed birthdays, unread messages, canceled plans. It feels like watching people you love pull away because your ambition makes them uncomfortable. It feels like guilt, and it feels like grit. There was a moment, about a year before that promotion, when I almost quit. I had stayed late one night, again, trying to fix an error someone else made. The office was dark except for the blue glow of my monitor. My stomach growled. I hadn't eaten since lunch. I heard footsteps. Thought it might be the janitor. But it was someone else. Mr. Hallberg, one of the senior partners. The kind of man who spoke in numbers and walked like he owned time. He looked surprised to see me. "You're still here?" he asked. I nodded. Had to rework the numbers from Madison's report. He raised an eyebrow. Said nothing. Then, just before leaving, he looked back. "You're not invisible, you know." I didn't understand what he meant then, but now I do. He saw me, not just physically. He saw my work, my determination, my quiet refusal to fold. That night gave me just enough to keep going. Madison, on the other hand, saw none of it. Because people like her never look down, unless it's to check their reflection in a phone screen. She saw me as a placeholder, a background character in her fast-track story. Which is why, when the board asked for recommendations on who should lead the next high-profile account, she assumed her name was already on the list. But it wasn't. Mine was. She confronted me in the elevator 2 days before the announcement. The doors had barely closed when she turned to me with narrowed eyes. "What are you playing at?" she asked. I blinked. "Excuse me? You're trying to embarrass me. You're using this project to make me look bad." "No," I said quietly. "You're doing that all on your own," she scoffed. "You think you're better than me now?" "No," I said again, voice calm. "I think I'm finally starting to believe I belong here." The elevator stopped. The doors opened. I stepped out first. There was no mic drop, no dramatic exit, just a shift. Like when a scale finally tips after being off balance for too long. That week, I worked harder than ever, not to prove anything to her, but to honor the girl who once cried in a graduation gown, alone on the floor. To honor my abuela, who called me her little phoenix. To honor the voice inside me that had been whispering for years. "You're meant for more." On the morning of the promotion ceremony, I stood in front of my mirror in a tailored navy suit. No one had bought it for me. No stylist had picked it out. I had saved for months to afford something that didn't wrinkle when I sat down. Something that made me feel like I deserved the seat at the table. And I did. The ceremony was small, just a conference room, some pastries, a few words from the executive team. But it felt monumental. Like walking through a doorway I had been banging on for years. They called my name. People clapped. I stood, walked forward, and shook hands with the same people who once looked past me in meetings. Then I turned, holding the certificate of promotion, and met Madison's eyes across the room. She didn't smile, but she stood, walked over, handed me the coffee. And in that moment, everything was quiet again. Not because I had won, but because I had stopped needing her approval to feel whole. The coffee in my hand grew cold, but I held it a little longer. Not because I wanted to drink it, but because it symbolized something she would never fully understand. Control. For the first time, I had it. Quietly, without asking, without raising my voice or slamming doors. And maybe that's what confused her most, that I didn't need to humiliate her the way she once did to me. I just needed to be seen. And now, finally, I was. I left the room shortly after the ceremony, nodding to the few coworkers who smiled sincerely. There weren't many. Office politics doesn't breed friendship. It breeds alliances. And those shift with power. But someone followed me into the hallway. I heard the steps before I turned. "Hey," a soft voice said. It was Jordan, one of the data analysts from the 3rd floor. We barely talked, but I remembered him once helping me reset the office printer when no one else bothered. He smiled, a little awkward. "I just wanted to say, that was well-deserved. I've seen the work you've put in, even when no one else said anything." I nodded, unsure what to say. He scratched the back of his neck. "Some of us noticed, just didn't know how to speak up." His words weren't polished, but they meant more to me than half the handshakes I got that day. "Thanks," I said. "That means a lot." He smiled again, then turned and disappeared into the stairwell. And I stood there alone, feeling more at peace than I had in months. Later that evening, I took the long way home, walked 5 blocks out of my way just to breathe. The city was noisy, horns, sirens, chatter, but inside me there was silence, a good kind, the kind that happens after a long storm when everything is still damp, but the sky finally clears. I stopped at my favorite coffee cart. The man behind the counter knew me by name. "Promotion day?" he asked, gesturing to the suit. I nodded. "About time," he said. "You always looked like someone who knew where they were going." Funny. I used to come here when I felt lost. When I was too broke to afford lunch, I'd order the cheapest coffee just to sit under the awning and watch the world move. I wondered if the man had seen me then too, notebook in hand, eyes tired. I took my coffee, this one warm, intentional, and kept walking. When I got home, I sat on my small couch, kicked off my heels, and stared at the framed photo on my shelf. Me and my abuela, arms around each other at graduation. I whispered, "I did it, abuela." They saw me. And maybe it was silly, but I swore the photo smiled back. But the story doesn't end there, because promotion isn't a finish line. It's just a different battlefield. Now I had a team, a budget, expectations. And Madison? She was still there, still smirking in meetings, still finding subtle ways to undermine. But something had changed. She no longer had power over me. Not because of the title, but because I no longer sought her validation. And when someone loses that control over you, they feel it. A week later, I walked into a meeting to find Madison already seated at the conference table, flipping through one of my reports. She looked up, then leaned back in her chair. "Not bad," she said. "For someone who used to shadow me." I placed my folder down and met her gaze. "Funny. I was just thinking the same thing. How far I've come from being in your shadow." Her smile froze for half a second before returning. "That's the thing about passive-aggressive people. They only have power when you play nice, when you pretend their little barbs don't hurt. But when you meet their energy with calm clarity, they don't know what to do with it." In the weeks that followed, I made it my mission to create space. For people like me, the quiet ones, the overlooked, the interns who stayed late, the assistants who did the real work behind the scenes. I promoted 2 women on my team. One of them cried in my office when I told her. "No one's ever believed in me like this," she said. I smiled. "Then get used to it." Because I remembered what it felt like, to wait for someone to tap you on the shoulder and say, "Now it's your turn." And sometimes when no one does, you tap your own shoulder, and you rise, but not everyone celebrates your rise. One afternoon, I overheard a conversation in the break room. Madison was venting to another manager. I wasn't supposed to hear it, but they didn't notice me walking in. "She's only up there because she works harder than everyone else. It's not talent, it's obsession." It stung more than I expected. Not because it was true, but because it was meant to reduce me. As if working hard was something to be ashamed of. I didn't confront her. Instead, I walked to my office, closed the door, and opened a blank document. I started writing the mentorship program I had been thinking about for months. Because if working hard got me here, I was going to make damn sure no one else had to crawl through broken glass just to be seen. I didn't launch the mentorship program right away. I let it simmer, refine itself in the quiet spaces between meetings and emails. I knew that if I rushed it, it would look like a reaction, like a petty attempt to do better than someone else. But this wasn't about Madison. It was about me. And the dozens of others I had watched fade into corners, their ambition slowly dying behind forced smiles and fake thank yous. I started small. Every Friday afternoon, I blocked off my calendar and opened my office to anyone on the team who wanted help. Not feedback, not performance reviews, just help. At first, only one person showed up, a shy intern named Elsie. She barely spoke above a whisper and constantly apologized for everything, her questions, her notes, even her breathing. She reminded me too much of myself, so I listened, gave her tools, let her shadow me, not to make copies or take notes, but to learn, really learn. 2 weeks later, another person showed up, then another. Eventually, I had to book a larger space just to fit them all. People started calling it the Friday table. No one was required to be there, but word spread. And soon it wasn't just interns, junior analysts, new hires. Even a few associates who had once looked through me now sat with notepads in hand. I taught them what no one had taught me: how to read a room, how to hold your ground without raising your voice, how to craft an email that said no without actually saying the word, and most importantly, how to remember that your value isn't in how loud you are, but in how deeply you know your worth even when others don't. Meanwhile, Madison watched from the sidelines. She tried to brush it off at first, called it therapy circle during one meeting, laughed when someone mentioned how helpful it had been, but she was losing something, and she knew it. Relevance. And people like her don't take well to being outshined, especially by someone they once dismissed. One morning, she requested a meeting with me. I didn't flinch when her calendar invite appeared in my inbox. I accepted, set it in one of the smaller conference rooms. Neutral ground, no power plays. When I walked in, she was already seated, legs crossed, tablet in hand. She looked up, studied me for a moment like I was some new version of a person she thought she'd already filed away. "I wanted to talk," she said. I nodded. I figured. She didn't waste time. "I'm starting to feel like you're turning the team against me." I tilted my head. "That's a heavy assumption." "Well, perception matters." "It does," I agreed. "But so does intention." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "You don't like me, do you?" It was a trap, a carefully baited one. I leaned forward, elbows on the table. "It's not about liking or disliking. It's about what kind of leader I choose to be." "And what's that supposed to mean?" "It means I don't lead by comparison. I don't need anyone to fail so I can shine." She didn't respond right away. Her nails tapped softly against her tablet. "I never meant to make you feel small," she finally said. I looked her dead in the eye. "But you did." That silence between us stretched longer than it should have. "But that's not what this is about," I added, softening slightly. "This isn't about you at all anymore." She looked like she wanted to argue, to pull me back into that old game of proving, pleasing, defending, but I was already done playing. I stood. "If you want to grow, the door's open, just like it is for everyone else." And I left. I didn't look back. That meeting never made it into official records. No one ever spoke of it. But something changed afterward. She stopped mocking the mentorship sessions, stopped interrupting me in meetings. Whether it was reflection or retreat, I didn't care. Her silence was enough. 3 months later, I was asked to speak at a leadership summit, a panel on breaking through invisible ceilings. I almost said no, not because I wasn't ready, but because for so long I had convinced myself that my story didn't matter unless someone else gave it a microphone. But then I thought about Elsie, about Jordan, about my abuela, and I said yes. The day of the summit, I stood backstage in a navy blue dress. Not a suit this time. Something softer. Something mine. I watched the room fill through the curtains. Executives, managers, young professionals clinging to their badges and iced coffees. And suddenly, I wasn't nervous. I was present. When I stepped onto the stage, the lights hit my face, but I didn't squint. I breathed in, and I began. I was told I was just here to take notes. A soft laugh from the audience. But I'm not here to take notes anymore. I'm here to tell the story behind the numbers, the silence behind the meetings, the work that goes unseen until it's undeniable. As I spoke, I saw heads nodding. I saw pens pausing mid-sentence. I saw something shift in their faces. Recognition, maybe even hope. And when I finished, they clapped. Not out of politeness. Out of resonance. I left the stage knowing something had closed. A chapter, a wound, a version of me that didn't believe she belonged here. And as I stepped down, someone handed me a cup of coffee. I smiled. This time, I drank it. The applause from the summit echoed in my mind long after I left the building. But it wasn't the sound I remembered most. It was the silence that followed. That sacred stillness after you finally say the truth out loud. The kind of silence that doesn't feel empty, but full. Like something inside you just locked into place. I walked down the marble steps outside, the late afternoon sun bouncing off the city windows, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was running. I wasn't chasing approval or bracing for rejection. I was just walking, whole, grounded. Me. That night I called my grandmother. She had been living with my cousin since her last fall, but her voice was still strong, still warm. "TV online," she said proudly. "Annie's panel. You looked like a queen." I laughed. "Not a queen, abuela, just someone finally standing up straight." "Same thing," she replied. She didn't ask about Madison. She didn't ask about the office politics or the stress. She asked if I had eaten, if I had slept, if my shoes were comfortable. Love doesn't need to ask the right questions. It just needs to show up. I hung up with tears in my eyes, not from sadness, but from the weight of being truly seen. But life has a strange way of testing your growth the moment you think you've arrived. Because 2 weeks after the summit, I was called into an executive meeting. Not as a guest, but as a key contributor. I had proposed a restructuring plan that could save the company millions in operating costs, while also expanding our mentorship initiatives across departments. I expected resistance. What I didn't expect was who it came from. Madison. Again. She had been asked to review my plan as part of the internal audit team, and she came prepared, with counter-arguments, skepticism, and spreadsheets marked in red. I walked into the boardroom and saw her sitting across from me, calm, composed, and in some subtle way, ready to make a point. "We've reviewed your proposal," she said, her voice crisp. "And while there are some interesting ideas, there are concerns about scalability and efficiency." I nodded slowly. "What kind of concerns?" She clicked her pen. "Namely, the mentorship expansion. There's no clear evidence it increases productivity or retention." I let her finish. Let the silence fill the room. Then I stood. "Madison," I said calmly, "how many people have you trained in the last 6 months?" She blinked. "Excuse me?" "I'm just asking. How many employees have you mentored or directly impacted with skills that contributed to team growth?" The room went quiet. She shifted slightly in her chair. "That's not the point." "No, that's exactly the point." I turned to the board members. If we only measure worth in numbers, we miss the reason those numbers even exist. You can have all the data in the world, but if no one feels valued, they'll leave. And when they leave, they take their potential with them. There was a pause. Then the head of HR spoke. "I've actually been receiving feedback from junior staff. They're staying longer, performing better, and citing your mentorship sessions as part of their development." Madison looked stunned. Not because she was caught off guard, but because she hadn't anticipated that I'd now have allies in the room. Real ones. Not by manipulation, not by power games, but by impact. After the meeting, I stayed behind. Packed my folders slowly. Madison lingered at the other end of the table, as if waiting for something. She finally walked over. "You made your point," she said. I looked at her. "Wasn't trying to make one," I said. "I was just telling the truth." She hesitated. Then, in a voice lower than I'd ever heard her use, she said, "You're not who I thought you were." I met her eyes. "No," I said. "I never was. You just never bothered to look." And I left. That night I went home and stood in front of the mirror again. No makeup, no lights, just me. And for once I didn't need to rehearse my strength. I lived in it. I didn't know where my career would go next. I didn't know if Madison would ever come around, or if office politics would swallow someone else the way it once tried to swallow me. But I did know this. I had built something no title could offer. A reputation, a purpose, a place that couldn't be taken away by anyone's smirk. And one day, when the time came for someone else to step into that boardroom shaking in their shoes, they'd find a chair already waiting for them, because I made sure of it. Months passed. The seasons shifted. And with them, so did I. Not in loud, visible ways, but in the quiet kind of growth that changes how you enter a room, how you breathe, how you speak without needing to raise your voice. I was invited to more meetings now, not to observe, not to take notes, but to contribute. My name appeared on project leads. People started introducing me with respect instead of surprise. Even the interns looked at me differently, but I stayed grounded. Because I knew how easy it was to let validation become your only fuel. I didn't rise to prove anyone wrong anymore. I rose to stay in alignment with the person I was becoming. Still, the past has a way of checking in, just to make sure you haven't forgotten. It was a Monday morning when I saw her name on the sign-in sheet again. Madison, not in a meeting, not for a presentation. She had signed up for my Friday mentorship session. I stared at the list for a long time, wondering if it was a mistake. Maybe someone else with the same name? But no, it was her handwriting, her signature. When Friday came, I tried to prepare myself for what that might look like. Would she challenge me in front of the others? Would it be a power play? Would it be some passive attempt to show face? But when she walked in, she was different. Not physically. She still wore the same crisp suits, carried herself with that effortless grace. But her eyes, they had softened. Less sharp, more searching. She sat near the back, said nothing at first, just listened. I went on with the session as usual, guiding a group of new analysts through a case study, asking questions, encouraging their insights. Then I opened the floor. Any thoughts? A few hands went up, some nervous, some eager. Then hers. Everyone glanced at her. I could feel the room hold its breath. Yes, Madison? She looked right at me. I never really understood how much work goes into guiding others. I used to think leadership was just being right the loudest. She paused. I was wrong. Her voice didn't tremble, but it wasn't proud either. It was measured, intentional. Thanks for this, she added. For all of this. I nodded. Appreciation doesn't expire, I said gently, but accountability doesn't either. A few heads turned. Madison didn't flinch. I know, she said. I'm working on both. And that was the end of it. No dramatic apology, no breakdown, just the smallest spark of humility where once there was only ego. After the session, she stayed behind. Everyone else left. We stood in silence for a moment. She finally spoke. I didn't come today to fix anything. I just needed to understand what you were building. I looked at her. And? She met my gaze. You're building something real. That moment didn't erase the years of passive insults or dismissals. But it did something more important. It released the weight I didn't even realize I was still carrying. I didn't forgive her because she earned it. I forgave her because I didn't need to hold the grudge anymore. It had no power left. She left the room quietly, and I stood there, alone again, but lighter this time. That night, I went home and wrote in my journal, something I hadn't done in years. I used to write when I felt invisible. Now, I wrote because I wanted to remember, not the pain, but the process. I wrote about every ignored idea, every coffee run, every moment someone smirked and underestimated me, and how each of those moments became bricks in the foundation I stood on now. I wrote about my grandmother's bouquet, about the cold ramen in my graduation gown, about Jordan and Elsie, and about the coffee Madison handed me the day I was promoted. Each moment, seemingly small, but woven into something much bigger. The story of becoming. Not a hero, not a savior, just whole. And the thing about being whole, you stop needing applause. You stop fearing criticism. You start choosing what matters. And you realize, maybe for the first time, that you're no longer taking notes for someone else's story. You're writing your own. The mentorship sessions grew. What started as a few curious interns had become a steady stream of employees from across departments. People who didn't feel like they had a voice. People who had ideas but no one to listen. People who, like me, had once believed that success only came to those born closer to it. I didn't advertise these sessions. I didn't put out memos or ask for buy-in from executives. I just kept showing up. Every Friday. Same room, same open chair policy. And slowly, something beautiful began to happen. They started helping each other. One afternoon, I watched Elsie, yes, the same soft-spoken intern, walk another new analyst through a complicated financial model. Her voice was steady, clear. Her hands moved with purpose over the spreadsheet like she had been doing this for years. She glanced up at me for a moment. I gave her a nod, said nothing. She didn't need me anymore. And that was the point. Empowerment isn't about being needed. It's about making sure others know they're capable, even when you're not around to remind them. One Friday, after a session had ended and most had cleared out, I lingered by the window, watching the rain trace thin lines across the glass. That's when the door creaked. It was Jordan. He hadn't been to a session in a while, but we often crossed paths in meetings. Hey, he said. Got a minute? I turned and smiled. Always. He stepped inside, a little hesitant. He looked different, stronger, more confident. I just wanted to thank you, he said, voice quieter now. I applied for the lead data strategist role. I raised an eyebrow. That's a big jump. He nodded. Yeah, I wouldn't have done it 6 months ago. But I started believing I was more than the guy who fixes spreadsheets. And I got the job. I felt my smile grow. That's incredible, Jordan. He scratched his chin, looked away for a second. When I told my parents, they said it was about time I stopped being support staff. I felt the sting behind his words. You're not support staff, I said. You're the structure. He looked at me, something flickering in his eyes, like a child who finally hears the truth after years of noise. He left the room lighter than he came in. Later that evening, I sat on my couch, laptop open, finalizing the new mentorship proposal to present to the executive board. Not just a program, but a permanent department, a network, a space inside the company built for people like me. People who didn't fit the mold but were shaping the company anyway. The plan had metrics, projections, testimonies, but most of all, it had heart. And heart, I'd learned, is what makes ideas stick. A week later, I presented it. In the same room where I once sat in silence, only speaking when asked to. This time I stood. Halfway through the presentation, I paused. I looked around. And I spoke, not with numbers or graphs, but with memory. I was once told I was just here to take notes, I said, scanning the room. So I did, but not the kind they meant. I took note of who spoke, who was heard, who was ignored. And now I'm here not because someone finally gave me permission, but because I refused to wait for it. The room was quiet, not tense, reflective. And when I finished, they didn't just clap. They approved it, unanimously. The Mentorship and Leadership Equity Initiative was born, and I was appointed its first director. I didn't celebrate with champagne or some grand post online. I went to the cemetery, took a cab across town with a single yellow lily in hand. I placed it on my abuela's grave. Lo logramos, I whispered. We made it. The wind rustled through the trees like a blessing. On the way home, I passed by the old coffee cart. The man wasn't there anymore. Maybe he'd retired. But I ordered a coffee anyway, from the new guy. He didn't know me, didn't call me Mija like the old one did. But he smiled just the same. It reminded me, life keeps going. We all leave things behind eventually. But if we do it right, we leave something behind that matters. That following Monday, a new assistant joined the company. She was assigned to work under my department. She knocked gently on my door, eyes wide, holding a notepad. Sorry to bother you, she said. I'm just here to take notes. I smiled. I stood, walked to her, and said, No, you're here to learn. Let's make sure you never forget that. She blinked, stunned for a moment, then smiled. Small, but growing. We sat down and got to work. She reminded me of myself. Not in the way she looked, but in the way she held herself too tightly, as if the world would fall apart if she made a single mistake. Her name was Talia. She apologized before every question, wrote everything down like her job depended on each word. On her third day, she stayed late after everyone left. I was gathering my things when she peeked through the doorway, notebook in hand. Can I ask you something? She said softly. Of course. She stepped in, closed the door gently behind her. How did you know? You were more than just support? I sat down again, nodding slowly. Because I started paying attention to the way people relied on me, even when they didn't say thank you. She looked confused. Sometimes, I continued, people get so used to your competence they stop noticing it. But that doesn't mean it's not valuable. You have to learn to notice it yourself. Her eyes welled up, and she looked away, embarrassed. Sorry, she whispered. It's just, I've never had anyone tell me that. You have someone now, I said. It wasn't a grand moment, but it was honest, and that made it powerful. In the weeks that followed, I watched Talia bloom. She started raising her hand in meetings, sharing ideas, correcting small errors before anyone noticed. And eventually, someone from another department asked if she could help with a new initiative. Only if I don't lose her, I joked. But I meant it. I had learned that real leadership wasn't about collecting power. It was about distributing it, giving it away in pieces to the ones who had never been offered even a scrap. And as the mentorship department grew, the culture began to change. People talked differently, walked differently. There were fewer jokes made at the expense of assistants, fewer names forgotten in meetings, more ideas credited to the people who actually came up with them. One afternoon, I ran into the CEO in the elevator. He was an older man, sharp but kind, known for remembering birthdays and company milestones. We made small talk. I thanked him again for approving the initiative. He nodded, then said something that stuck with me. "You've changed the atmosphere around here. People walk with more purpose. They look each other in the eye more." He paused, then smiled. "You didn't just make the company better. You made people better." I don't remember what I said in response. Probably just smiled politely. But inside, I carried those words with me like a shield. Still, the past finds its way back. Always. A month later, I was invited to a leadership conference, this time as a keynote speaker. The topic: invisible labor and the cost of being overlooked. It felt almost surreal. Years ago, I couldn't even get my emails read. Now I was being asked to teach rooms full of executives about the very struggle they had once ignored. I crafted my speech carefully. No theatrics, no bitterness, just truth. I stood at the podium, looked out into a sea of dark blazers and blinking name tags, and began. When I was promoted, someone who used to mock me handed me a cup of coffee, and I didn't gloat. I didn't throw it away. I drank it. Because by then, I had already learned that real power doesn't come from proving others wrong. It comes from proving yourself right, and letting that be enough. I paused. Let the silence stretch. Today, I stand here not as someone who was chosen, but as someone who chose herself. The applause came slowly, then built like a wave. Not thunderous, but respectful. Deep. Meaningful. Afterward, as I walked off stage, a young woman stopped me in the hallway. Tears in her eyes. Her badge identified her as an operations assistant from a different firm. "I thought I was alone," she said. "You're not," I told her. "You never were." We hugged. And in that moment, I realized something. This wasn't about revenge. It never really was. It was about building a bridge out of everything I had once been buried under, about making sure the next woman didn't have to climb with bloodied hands and a tired heart. It was about leaving the door open and the light on. The night after the conference, I sat alone on my balcony, city lights flickering beneath a violet sky. The air was cool, but not cold. Just enough to remind me I was alive. I held a glass of water, not wine, not champagne, just water. Something simple, clean, real. It's funny how success, once imagined as red carpets and magazine covers, turns out to feel more like this. Quiet, steady, still. I thought about everyone who had ever told me to shrink, to wait my turn, to stay quiet, observe, obey. I thought about how many of them probably hadn't changed, how some were likely still mocking people like me in different rooms. And I realized it didn't matter anymore. I wasn't living for their recognition. I was living for the younger version of me who sat in break rooms staring into her paper coffee cup, wondering if this was all life had to offer. She would have been proud, not of the title, not of the salary, but of the voice. The unshakable, unapologetic voice that had finally stopped asking for permission. That weekend, I visited my mother for the first time in months. She lived in the same house I grew up in, still working part-time at the bakery on the corner. Still insisting I was too busy to come see her. But I went anyway. She opened the door, flour on her hands, apron tied messily around her waist. "You didn't call," she said. "I didn't want to give you time to say no," I replied. She stepped aside. I entered. The house smelled like bread and dust, like memories too old to clean away. We sat at the small kitchen table, the same one where she once told me that people like us didn't get promoted. I looked at her across that same faded wood, the burn mark still on the left edge from where she once set a hot pot down without a trivet. "I gave a keynote this week," I said casually. She looked at me surprised. "Oh? About invisible labor? About being overlooked?" She frowned. "That's a strange thing to talk about at work." I smiled gently. "It's what made me who I am." She didn't respond, just looked down at her hands. "I'm not blaming you," I added quickly. "I know you were trying to protect me." "I was," she said quietly. "I just didn't want you to get hurt." "I know, but I needed to be hurt. That's how I found my fight." She looked at me then, really looked, and for the first time in my life, I saw regret in her eyes. Not the kind that begged for forgiveness, but the kind that quietly mourned what could have been. You turned out strong, she said. I turned out seen, I corrected. There's a difference. She reached across the table and touched my hand. I'm proud of you, she whispered. And that was enough. I didn't need a billboard or a banner, just those 4 words, said without armor. On the way home, I stopped by the office. No one was there. It was Sunday. But I wanted to leave something on Talia's desk, a note. You're not just here to take notes. One day, someone will take yours and learn from them. I folded the paper, slid it under her mouse pad. I didn't sign it. She'd know. On Monday morning, she came into my office, notebook in hand. I got the position, she said, nearly breathless. What position? Associate project manager. They created a new role after seeing the proposal I wrote for the expansion. They said it was brave. I leaned back in my chair, smiled. It was brave. She hesitated, then added, I found your note. I said nothing. She smiled. I'll keep it. She turned to leave, then stopped at the door. You changed everything, she said softly. No, I replied. You did. I just made sure you knew it. After she left, I looked out the window at the city once more. And for the first time, I didn't see it as something I had to conquer. I saw it as something I belonged to. Not because I fought harder, but because I finally stopped believing that quiet meant small. It meant focus. And I had never been more focused in my life. The momentum didn't stop after that. With Talia stepping into her new role and Jordan thriving as a lead strategist, the ripple effect was undeniable. The people who used to hover around the edges of meetings were now leading them. The ones who once double-checked everyone else's work were now being trusted to own entire campaigns. But more than that, there was a shift in how people looked at one another. Longer eye contact, more names remembered, more space given, especially to those who used to fight for air. And for the first time, I began to feel something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. Peace. Not because the work was done, but because I no longer felt like I was the only one carrying the weight of making it better. Then came the awards season. The company hosted an annual recognition night, something I used to avoid. Watching people get applauded for performative work while those who kept everything running behind the scenes were barely invited, it used to make me nauseous. But this year was different. Because this year I was nominated. Not for performance, but for leadership. There was a new category. Transformational Leader of the Year. I hadn't even known I was being considered. Apparently, I had been nominated by 5 different departments. Quietly, anonymously, intentionally. The night of the ceremony, I wore a simple black dress. Nothing flashy, no glitter. I didn't want to shine because of what I wore. I wanted to shine because of what I built. As I walked into the venue, people greeted me by name. People I had only spoken to in passing, others I'd once mentored and forgotten. It was surreal. When they called my name, there was a brief second of silence, as if the entire room collectively processed what had just been said. Then applause, not forced, not polite, warm, real. I stood, heart pounding, legs steady, and walked to the stage. I took the microphone, and I spoke. When I first walked into this company, I was told I was just here to take notes. A few gasps, a few knowing chuckles. I believed it for a while, until I realized I was taking notes on everything this place could be. I looked out over the crowd, executives, interns, old colleagues, even Madison near the back. I didn't rise because someone cleared a path. I rose because I learned to walk through walls, and now I build doors where walls used to be. The applause this time was louder, stronger, but I didn't bask in it, because I knew something deeper now. The goal was never the spotlight. It was the table, and making sure everyone had a chair. After the ceremony, people came up to me with stories. One woman said her daughter had heard my speech on YouTube and used it for a school essay. Another said he had left a toxic company after watching my summit talk and finally joined a workplace where he felt safe. And a third? She was a former assistant from another firm. She looked me in the eye and said, "They used to call me invisible. Now they call me essential, because I stopped waiting to be seen and started acting like I mattered." I hugged her tightly. "You do matter," I said, and I meant it with every part of me. Later that night, I found myself alone in the elevator again. The same one where Madison once cornered me, accusing me of trying to embarrass her. And somehow, like a full circle moment, the doors opened. And there she was. She stepped in. looked at me, then looked at the plaque I was holding. "That's new," she said softly. I nodded. "You deserve it," she added. We stood in silence. Then, just before the doors opened on her floor, she turned to me. "I was wrong about you," she said. I didn't say anything, not because I didn't have words, but because I didn't need to. And maybe neither did she. She stepped out. The doors closed, and I stayed behind, quiet, steady, whole. The next morning, I walked into the office just like any other day. No banners, no congratulations taped to my door, no sudden parade of praise. And I was glad, because I didn't want to be treated like a statue. I wanted to keep moving, to keep working, to keep creating the kind of environment where people didn't have to win awards to feel valued. I placed the plaque gently on a shelf, behind a stack of books, beside an old photograph of my grandmother and me. A quiet reminder. Not of triumph, but of truth. Later that day, I got an email from someone I didn't know. A woman in another branch. She was a few years older than me. Her message was short. "I watched your speech last night. I've been in this company for 10 years and never once believed I had a voice. Until now." No name, just initials. I replied simply, "You've always had a voice. Now it's time to use it." I didn't expect a response, but I smiled anyway. That afternoon, I held another mentorship circle. They were getting bigger now, too big for the original conference room. So we moved into the open atrium, glass ceilings, high walls, plenty of light, and that felt symbolic too. I looked around and saw Talia leading a breakout group. Jordan was helping one of the new hires polish a pitch. A young woman I didn't even know was standing confidently at the whiteboard, and for a moment I just stood back and watched. They didn't need me anymore, not in the way they once did. And that was the goal. I had spent so much of my career thinking I needed to be in every room, in every conversation, steering every part of the ship. But now, I understood that real leadership is knowing when to step back and let others steer. To let others take the mic. To let others be the reason something extraordinary happens. That evening, I took a long walk after work. No destination, just movement. I passed the places I used to cry outside of, stairwells, street corners, the old bus stop where I'd call my grandmother and ask her why life felt so heavy. I passed the office building where I once dropped my resume off 3 times before someone even looked at it. I passed the bakery my mom still worked at, even though I'd offered a dozen times to help her retire. And eventually, I ended up standing in front of the first apartment I ever lived in. The 1-bedroom, creaky floor, heat-never-worked shoebox where I had slept on a mattress on the floor for almost a year. I stood on the sidewalk for a long time, staring up at the second-story window. That window had seen so many versions of me. The version that doubted everything. The version that cried into the dark at 3 a.m. after being passed over again. The version that took notes no one would ever read. And the version that quietly, stubbornly refused to quit. I whispered just loud enough for only the wind to hear, "Thank you for not giving up." I meant it. Not to the building, to myself. Because no one saw those nights. No one applauded that silence. But it was in that silence that I built the bones of the woman I had become. A few days later, I received a call I wasn't expecting. It was from a university I had never attended, but one that had apparently followed my work. They were hosting a conference for graduating students entering the workforce. They wanted me to speak. Not as an executive, not as a corporate figure, but as someone who understood what it meant to be overlooked, and what it took to rise anyway. At first, I hesitated. I wasn't sure I was the right person. I wasn't famous. I hadn't written a book. I wasn't a CEO. But then I remembered something my grandmother once told me. The ones worth listening to are the ones who learn to speak after years of being silenced. So I said yes. On the day of the conference, I stood backstage and watched rows of young faces file in, most of them nervous, some of them distracted, all of them standing on the edge of something they didn't yet understand. And I saw myself in them. Not the polished version of me, the messy one, the scared one, the one who had once begged the universe for a sign that she was going to be okay. When they called my name, I walked out slowly. No PowerPoint, no script, just a story. "My first year in corporate life," I began. Someone looked me in the eye and said, "You're just here to take notes." The room fell silent. I smiled. I thanked her. And I kept going. I watched their faces shift, saw how the words sank in. I didn't scream. I didn't fight back. I did something scarier. I got better. I paid attention. I worked harder. And when the time came, I was the one leading the room, and she was the one pouring my coffee. Laughter rippled through the crowd. But then I let the silence return. Success doesn't always look like a trophy. Sometimes it looks like walking into a room where people once ignored you, and being the reason they now sit up straighter. I shared more. Not just the victories, the rejections, the doubt, the therapy, the nights I stayed awake wondering if maybe they were right about me, and how I learned that the only opinion that mattered was the one I had of myself when I looked in the mirror. Afterward, students lined up to talk to me. Some wanted advice. Some just wanted to say thank you. But one girl stood quietly at the end of the line, clutching a notebook to her chest. She looked barely 18. Wide eyes, shoulders tense. When it was her turn, she didn't say much. Just this. My mom's a cleaner. She always told me not to aim too high, that I'd get hurt. But now, I think I want to try. I took her hand gently. You don't have to aim high, I said. You just have to aim true. The rest will rise to meet you. She smiled, tears in her eyes, and walked away with her notebook still pressed to her heart. I stood there for a long time after everyone left. Not because I was tired, but because something in me had shifted again. For years, I thought my story ended with the promotion. But now, I realized, that was just the beginning. The flight home was quiet. I sat by the window, watching clouds shift beneath me, a soft orange glow tinting the sky as the sun began to set. I didn't open my laptop, didn't check emails, didn't plan my next step. I just breathed. Somewhere over the Midwest, I reached into my bag and pulled out a folded piece of paper. The kind hotel staff leaves beside your breakfast tray. On the back of it, I began to write. Not a speech, not a proposal, just a letter. To myself. You didn't become powerful the day they gave you a title. You became powerful the day you stopped needing one. The words came fast, like they'd been waiting years for me to slow down enough to hear them. I kept writing. You used to believe strength meant silence, obedience, perfection, but now you know it's the opposite. Strength is speaking when your voice trembles. It's standing when your legs are shaking. It's letting people underestimate you and rising anyway. By the time the plane landed, I had filled the entire page. I folded it carefully and tucked it inside my wallet, behind my ID. A reminder of who I was before anyone knew my name. Back at the office, things were moving. The mentorship department had become more than just a program. It was now a core pillar of the company's culture. Executives were asking for updates. Other departments were replicating our format. One afternoon, the CEO stopped by my office unexpectedly. He didn't knock, just leaned in with a smile and said, "We're creating a new position, one that oversees mentorship across all branches. I want you to consider it." I blinked. He placed a folder on my desk. Director of Culture and Equity Development. It wasn't just a promotion. It was a legacy. He left me with the file, no pressure. Just an opportunity. That night, I walked the long way home again. Not because I needed to think, but because I needed to remember. I passed the same corners, the same bus stops, the same windows I had once stared through when the world felt impossible. And when I reached my building, I stood on the sidewalk for a moment longer, watching the light in my apartment window flicker on with the motion sensor. Safe, warm, waiting. I went inside, placed the folder on my coffee table, and poured a glass of water. As I sipped it, I thought about all the things that title wouldn't change. It wouldn't erase the years I was invisible. Wouldn't silence the voices that once told me I was too soft to lead. Wouldn't make the past prettier. But it would do something better. It would create space. For more voices, more stories, more chances for someone else to say, "I didn't think I belonged here," until I saw her. I opened the folder and signed the acceptance letter without hesitation. Then I closed it, placed it beside my award plaque, and whispered, "I'm not just here to take notes anymore." I looked out the window, the city stretching wide and endless before me. I'm here to write the whole damn story. The first meeting I led as Director of Culture and Equity Development was held in the largest conference hall our company had. Rows of chairs, spotlights angled just right, a glass wall that overlooked the skyline. But what struck me most wasn't the view. It was who filled the seats. Not just executives and department heads, but assistants, interns, custodial staff, people who, until now, had never been invited to sit at that kind of table. I stood at the podium and took a long breath. I didn't need notes. I looked around the room and spoke from a place far deeper than policy or structure. I used to sit in rooms like this one, only at the back, quiet, observing, carrying notebooks full of ideas that no one asked for. I paused, letting that settle. Some of you know exactly what I mean. Nods, stillness, eyes wide. I was once told I was just here to take notes. And maybe that was true for a while. But not anymore. I stepped away from the podium and walked down the steps, closer to the people I was here for. You're not just here to type meeting minutes, or to bring coffee, or to smile politely while others speak over you. You're here because you belong here. I watched shoulders drop, spines straighten, pens pause mid-sentence. You're here because you know things no one else knows, because you see what others miss, because your voice is not a decoration, it's a direction. The room was silent. Then one by one, people began to clap. Not loud, not performative, but real. Like something sacred was being acknowledged. After the session ended, I stood by the door and shook hands. One woman, maybe in her 60s, approached me with tears in her eyes. "I've worked in this building for 24 years, she said. "Today is the first day I felt seen." I placed my hand over hers. Then today is the first day of something new. When the room was empty again, I stayed. Sat on the front row, looked at the stage I had just walked down from, and thought about how far I'd come, not in distance, but in depth. Later that evening, I returned to my office to find a gift on my desk. No card, just a small box wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. Inside was a pen, black, elegant, simple, and beneath it, a note. For the woman who was never just here to take notes, she was always here to write the future. I didn't need to know who sent it, because in a way, they all had. Every person I'd met along the way, every mentor, every doubter, every assistant who once sat where I did, and every voice that had been silenced before mine found its strength. I placed the pen beside my framed photo of Abuela, then turned off the lights. As I walked through the hallway, the city beyond the windows shimmered with possibility, and I smiled to myself. Not because I had won, but because I had endured. Because I had turned smirks into strategy, dismissal into direction, silence into legacy. And one day, years from now, when someone asks how I became who I am, I'll tell them the truth. It started with a girl in a cheap suit, holding a notepad she couldn't afford, sitting in the back of a boardroom she wasn't invited to, and it ended with a woman holding the mic, not to speak louder, but to make sure the next voice could be heard. And if you've made it this far, maybe it's because you've been there too. Maybe someone once looked at you and told you what you weren't. Maybe you were called too quiet, too emotional, too ambitious, or too invisible. Maybe you sat in rooms where your ideas were taken, where your value was measured and how silent you could be. Maybe you've worked twice as hard for half the recognition, but hear me now. You were never just anything. Not just an assistant, not just a daughter, not just someone taking notes. You were watching, learning, becoming. And when the moment comes, when your voice finally echoes across the same room where you were once dismissed, don't shrink, don't apologize, don't wait for permission. Own it. Because your story is not small. It's not background. It's not optional. It's the reason someone else will one day find the courage to speak. So whether you're sitting in a quiet office right now, holding back tears at a family dinner, or staring at your reflection, wondering if any of this will ever matter, let this be your reminder. Your strength isn't in the title they give you. It's in the truth you carry. And the fire that won't go out. You're not just here to take notes. You're here to change the room. So if this story moved you, even a little, share. Send it to someone who needs to hear it. Because sometimes, the most powerful revenge is becoming exactly who they said you couldn't.